Capital in the 21st Century. Chapter 11. Merit and Inheritance in the Long Run. Part 1. The Rastignac Question. Let's start with a hypothetical. You're 23. You've just spent 3 brutal years getting a law degree, all-nighters, instant noodles, the whole tragic montage. And one evening, an older, slightly sinister gentleman leans across the dinner table and says, "Forget it. Forget all of it. Marry the rich girl down the hall instead. It's faster." That's not a meme from finance Twitter. That's the plot of a French novel published in 1835. Welcome to Chapter 11 of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Merit and Inheritance in the Long Run. Over the next 50 minutes, we're going to take this chapter apart slowly, the way Piketty likes it. Lots of data, lots of history, and because underneath the 600-page exterior, Piketty is basically a frustrated novelist. Lots of actual novels. So back to that dinner table. The novel is Honoré de Balzac's Pierre Goriot. Our hero is Eugene de Rastignac, broke, ambitious, fresh off the stagecoach from the provinces, living in a grim Parisian boarding house that smells, Balzac tells us with real affection, of boiled mutton and old umbrellas. The sinister gentleman is a fellow boarder named Vautrin, charming, generous, mysterious, and twist, secretly an escaped convict and master criminal living under a fake name. Vautrin sits Rastignac down and gives him what Piketty dryly calls a lesson in social and economic morality. I'd call it the bleakest career counseling session in the history of literature. Here's the gist. Vautrin does the math on a legal career. Years of unpaid apprenticeship, then, best case, after decades of grinding, maybe a position as a provincial public prosecutor, pulling in something like 5,000 francs a year, while slowly turning into, in Vautrin's words, a bitter, compromised little man who's forgotten how to enjoy anything. That's the ceiling, the absolute ceiling. Then Vautrin nods toward another resident of the boarding house, Victorine. Quiet, sad, illegitimate, currently disowned by her wealthy father and effectively penniless. And here's the catch. Victorine has a legitimate brother. And if that brother were to, say, die in a duel, Victorine would become her father's sole heir to a fortune of roughly 1,000,000 francs. 1,000,000 francs, invested at the going rate of around 5%, throws off about 50,000 francs a year. Forever. Starting immediately. That's 10 times what Rastignac's entire legal career could deliver at its absolute peak, and it requires no diploma, no decades, no apprenticeship. Vautrin, ever the problem solver, even offers to arrange the brother's death himself. He knows a guy. Now, Rastignac is horrified. He refuses on principle and spends the rest of the novel having a slow-motion moral crisis about it. But here is Piketty's actual point, and it's the point of this whole chapter. Vautrin's arithmetic wasn't villain logic. It was just logic. Piketty and his colleagues went back and dug through the real tax records, probate records, and wage data of Restoration-era France, the 1820s, and Vautrin's numbers basically check out. A spectacular career, the kind that put you in the top 1 or 2% of all labor incomes in the country, sustained over an entire working life, produced a standard of living that a perfectly ordinary, medium-sized inheritance could match on day one. It wasn't just France either. Cross the Channel a decade or so earlier, to Jane Austen's England, and you find the same arithmetic running the whole plot. Mr. Darcy, in Pride and Prejudice, has an income of £10,000 a year, an almost cartoonish sum for the time, the kind of number that makes an entire ballroom go quiet when it's whispered. And where does it come from? Not from a job, Darcy doesn't have a job. It comes from land inherited generation after generation, sitting there producing rent whether Darcy gets out of bed or not. Meanwhile, the entire engine of that novel's plot, five Bennet sisters, all of marriageable age, all in a barely concealed panic, is driven by one brutal legal fact. Their father's estate is entailed to a distant male cousin. The Bennet women cannot inherit it, no matter how clever or accomplished they are. Their only route to financial security is marriage. Note that none of this, not Darcy's fortune, not the Bennets' predicament, has anything to do with talent, effort, or virtue. It's just where everyone happened to land in the inheritance lottery before the story even begins. So here's the question this chapter is really asking, and it's bigger than two old novels. Across the last 2 centuries, in different countries, different decades, when has a society been one where what you do determines what you get? And when has it been a society where what you inherit, or who you marry, quietly outweighs all of that? And here's the part that should make the back of your neck prickle a little. Which kind of society do you think you're living in right now? Because here's a modern version of Vautrin's speech. Picture a slightly too confident guy at a rooftop bar in London, nursing an overpriced drink, telling his younger cousin, "Look, you can spend the next 15 years grinding at a law firm, 80-hour weeks, maybe make partner by 45 if you're lucky and don't get laid off in the next downturn. Or your girlfriend's family owns that flat in Notting Hill outright, no mortgage, bought for about £4,000 in 1971. You do the math. Sound familiar? If you've ever rolled your eyes at the phrase Nepo baby, or felt a complicated knot in your stomach watching Succession, or scrolled past yet another article about millennials, avocado toast, and house deposits, then congratulations. You've already intuited the central tension of this chapter, 200 years after Balzac wrote it down. Here's the roadmap for the next 50 minutes. In Part 2, we'll see how 2 world wars and a Great Depression essentially detonated Vautrin's entire world, and created, almost by accident, the most meritocratic moment in modern history. In Part 3, we'll trace how, since roughly the 1980s, the old patterns have been quietly creeping back, driven by something most economics lectures never mention: old people and houses. In Part 4, we'll talk about the difference between a society of rentiers and a society of managers, and why the line between Bill Gates and a French cosmetics heiress is blurrier than either of them would like to admit. And in Part 5, we're going to land this entire 200-year argument directly on top of this year's headlines: France's brutal fight over the so-called Zuckman tax, and British farmers driving tractors through London over inheritance tax. So get comfortable. And let's go back to the world Vautrin actually lived in. A world where, for about 100 years, doing nothing and inheriting everything was, quite literally, the smartest financial decision available to most people who had the option. Part 2, The Great Detonation: How 2 Wars Accidentally Built a Meritocracy. Picture Vautrin's world as a beautifully maintained machine. Land, bonds, and family fortunes sit quietly, generation after generation, producing 5% a year like clockwork. Inflation is essentially zero for a century. A fortune your great-grandfather built in 1810 is still, in real terms, the same fortune in 1910. It is an extraordinarily stable, extraordinarily unfair machine. And then, between 1914 and 1945, the machine gets fed into a wood chipper. Piketty's data on this is honestly one of the more startling things in the whole book. The ratio of total private wealth to national income in France, Britain, and Germany, a number that had sat placidly around 6 or 7 to 1 for the entire 19th century, collapses to somewhere around 2 to 1 by the mid-1940s. Most of the capital simply stops existing. How does a fortune disappear? Let's count the ways, because each one is its own small historical horror story. First, bombs. You can't earn 5% a year on a factory that's a smoking crater. Physical destruction in both wars wiped out housing stock, rail lines, ports, entire industrial districts. Second, inflation, used quite deliberately as a weapon against creditors. Germany's hyperinflation of 1923 is the textbook case. Prices doubling every few days, people pushing wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread, and any fortune sitting safely in German government bonds reduced, essentially, to confetti. If you were a prudent, conservative saver who'd done everything right, 1923 personally bankrupted you. If you'd taken out a large debt, 1923 effectively paid it off for you. The whole moral logic of patient, careful saving got inverted overnight. Third, and this is the one people forget, bankruptcy and default. Vautrin's million francs, remember, was sitting partly in government bonds. Across Europe, sovereign defaults and currency conversions after both wars quietly erased huge piles of exactly that kind of safe wealth. Fourth, taxes, but not the polite, gradual kind. Wartime governments, desperate for revenue, introduced steeply progressive income and inheritance taxes that would have been politically unthinkable in 1900. Britain's top marginal income tax rate, which had been essentially zero for the rentier class in the Victorian era, eventually climbed past 90%. The United States, yes, the United States, had a top marginal rate above 90% for most of the 1950s under a Republican president, Eisenhower. Try saying that sentence at a dinner party today and watch what happens. So by 1950, here's the landscape. The great fortunes of the Belle Epoque are gone, or gutted, or taxed into submission. Continental Europe is rebuilding from rubble. And into this flattened landscape walks a generation of young men and women who, for the first time in modern history, cannot simply inherit their way to comfort, because there is comparatively little left to inherit. What do they do instead? They work. They get educated, on a scale no society had ever attempted, the post-war expansion of public universities, the American GI Bill, the explosive growth of European secondary schooling. And crucially, wages, particularly for skilled and professional labor, start rising faster than the depleted stock of capital can recover. This is the world Piketty calls, almost wistfully, the high point of merit over inheritance. The 30 glorious years, the French call it, les 30 glorieuses. A doctor's son and a farmer's daughter could plausibly end up in similar economic territory by their 40s, based mostly on what they'd done with their working lives. Not because capitalism had become inherently fairer. Because capital itself had been temporarily, catastrophically destroyed. And this is where Piketty makes the move that annoys both the political left and the political right simultaneously, which is usually a good sign you're onto something true. The political left loves to tell the story of the post-war boom as proof that good policy, strong unions, public investment, progressive taxation, built a fair, prosperous middle class. And that's partly true. But Piketty's data insists on an uncomfortable addition. A huge amount of that fairness was also just an accident of timing. It was the temporary condition of an economy starting from a wealth-to-income ratio near zero, after the wood chipper had done its work. Meanwhile, the political right loves to tell the story of the post-war boom as proof that free markets and hard work naturally produce broad prosperity. Also partly true. But it conveniently skips the part where it took 2 world wars, a global depression, and tax rates north of 90% to clear the board first. Let's ground this in one family, a composite but a representative one, built straight out of Piketty's archival data. Imagine a French notary's family in Lyon. In 1900, grandfather notary lives comfortably off inherited land and bonds, never really needs a profession at all, in the Vautrin style. By 1945, that land has been fought over twice, the bonds have been inflated to nothing, and what's left of the family fortune wouldn't buy a decent car. So grandfather's son, let's call him the engineer's son, actually has to become an engineer, properly. Exams, a degree, a real career at a real firm. And because post-war France is rebuilding everything from bridges to power plants, skilled engineers in 1955 are paid extremely well relative to the surviving capital income in their own family. For one generation, merit doesn't just feel important, it mathematically outperforms inheritance. Now hold that family in your head because in Part 3, we're going to watch the engineer son's own children grow up in the 1980s and watch the entire machine slowly, quietly start rebuilding itself. Part 3, the quiet comeback, houses, retirees, and the return of patrimonial society. Here's a riddle. What single object, more than any stock portfolio, any inheritance, any trust fund, best explains the return of capital's grip on modern economies? The answer, according to Piketty, is embarrassingly mundane. A house. Specifically, a house in a major city, bought decades ago for what now sounds like pocket change. Let's pick up our composite family. The engineer's son from Lyon, call him Pierre, buys an apartment near the city center in, say, 1975, for the equivalent of a modest sum, financed with a normal mortgage on a normal engineer's salary. He's not wealthy, he's solidly, respectably middle class. Fast forward to today. That same apartment in that same neighborhood is worth an absolutely staggering multiple of what Pierre paid, not because Pierre did anything clever, but because urban property in major Western cities has appreciated dramatically faster than wages for the past 40 years. Pierre, simply by holding on to a building, has become, on paper, much wealthier than his own children, who are in their 30s, working hard, professionally accomplished, and who cannot remotely afford to buy the apartment they grew up in. This is the engine of what Piketty calls the return of patrimonial, or inheritance-based, society. And it runs on three trends running in parallel since roughly 1980. Trend 1. Capital, broadly, started growing faster than the overall economy again. Remember that wealth-to-income ratio that collapsed to around 2-to-1 after the wars. By the 2010s, in countries like France and Britain, it had climbed back toward 5 or 6-to-1, territory not seen since the Belle Epoque. Capital in aggregate terms is back. Trend 2. Growth itself, both economic growth and population growth, has slowed in most rich countries since the post-war boom ended. And this matters enormously for inheritance, for a reason that's almost mechanical. When an economy grows fast and the population grows fast, each generation is, on average, much larger and much richer than the one before it, so any individual inheritance is small relative to what you'll earn yourself over a lifetime. When growth slows and populations age, fortunes built decades ago don't get diluted across as many heirs, and they loom much larger relative to a young person's own lifetime earnings. Slow growth, in other words, doesn't just mean less prosperity. It specifically tilts the whole system back toward the past, toward what already exists, rather than what gets newly created. Trend 3, and this is the one that should genuinely surprise you. People are now dying much older and inheriting much later in life. In Vautrin's France, Life expectancy was low enough that you might plausibly inherit your fortune in your 20s or 30s, exactly when Rastignac needed it, exactly when it could launch an entire adult life. Piketty's data on modern France shows the average age of inheritance has drifted up into the 50s. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely strange and a little sad. A 50-year-old inheriting a parent's house is not getting a launchpad for an ambitious young life. They're getting a retirement supplement. Piketty's vivid phrase for this is that we're drifting toward a society where people will, increasingly, live off their inheritance, not in their 20s as bold young Rastignacs, but in their 60s as comfortable retirees coasting on a transfer that arrived just before they themselves stopped working. Now let's connect this directly to today's headlines, because this isn't abstract economic history. It's the exact fight playing out in Britain right now. In April 2026, the United Kingdom ended a policy that had stood in various forms since 1984. Full, unlimited inheritance tax relief on agricultural and family business property. Until that date, a working farm, regardless of its market value, could pass from parent to child entirely free of inheritance tax. Now, the first £2.5 million of combined farm and business assets still get full relief, but anything above that faces tax at an effective rate of 20%. Farming unions have called this the death of the family farm, warning that tens of thousands of farms could be affected. The government insists it's targeting only the wealthiest few hundred estates a year. Who's right? Genuinely, reasonable people disagree, partly because British farmland prices have themselves been inflated for years by exactly the kind of capital-seeking safe havens behavior Piketty describes, which means a modest, working farm can now carry a paper value that has nothing to do with how much income it actually produces. Notice the structure of that argument, though, because it's pure Vautrin, replayed 2 centuries later. A farming family argues, this land is our livelihood, our work, our merit, earned through generations of actual labor on actual soil. The Treasury argues, regardless of how it's used today, an asset this large, passed by birth rather than purchase, is exactly the kind of inherited advantage a fair tax system exists to moderate. Both sides are correct about something real. That collision, is this fortune the fruit of labor, or merely the accident of birth, is almost word for word the question Balzac put in Vautrin's mouth in 1835. In Part 4, we're going to push on a related, trickier question. When a fortune is genuinely self-made, built from nothing, by one extraordinarily talented or lucky individual, does that make the whole system fair again? Piketty's answer involves Bill Gates, a French cosmetics fortune, and a chart that might be the single most quoted graphic in this entire book. Part 4, Self-Made Myths, Gates, Betancourt, and Supermanagers. Let's play a quick game. I'm going to describe 2 fortunes, and you tell me which one sounds more legitimate. Fortune A, built by a college dropout who co-founded a software company in a garage, revolutionized personal computing, worked relentless hours for decades, and became, for years, the richest man on the planet. Fortune B, inherited by a woman who never worked a single day for the cosmetics company that produced her wealth because her father founded it, and she simply held the shares. That's an easy one, right? Fortune A is Bill Gates. Fortune B is Lillian Betancourt, heir to L'Oreal, who, until her death in 2017, was for years the richest woman in the world, almost entirely on inherited shares. Gates feels like a triumph of merit. Betancourt feels like a fairly pure case of Vautrin's million francs, just denominated in shampoo instead of government bonds. Here is the chart Piketty puts directly underneath that comfortable assumption, and it is genuinely one of the more devastating images in the whole book. He tracks, decade by decade, the size of the largest fortunes on the Forbes list relative to global average wealth, and then separately tracks the typical rate of return on a large diversified fortune. His finding: across the 1990s and 2000s, the wealth of people at the very top of the Forbes list, the Gateses, but also the Betancourts, the heirs and the founders alike, grew at a rate that consistently and significantly outpaced average global wealth growth, somewhere in the range of 6 to 7% a year, even after accounting for the money some of them gave away. Now here's the punchline, and it's a subtle one, so stay with me. Once a fortune crosses a certain threshold, somewhere in the hundreds of millions or low billions, Piketty's argument is that the day-to-day talent of the person whose name is on it stops mattering very much to its growth rate. A fortune that size hires the best wealth managers, gets access to the best diversified investment vehicles, the best tax structuring, the best everything purely because of its size, not because of anyone's personal genius. Bill Gates's fortune, post-Microsoft, has grown enormously through the Gates Foundation's investment portfolio and other holdings, managed largely by professionals, compounding at rates not wildly different from the structural advantage that lets a Betancourt-style inherited fortune also compound, decade after decade, regardless of whether the heir shows up to the office. This is Piketty's central, deliberately uncomfortable claim. At sufficient scale, self-made and inherited fortunes start to converge, because both are increasingly driven by the same underlying force, the simple, compounding mathematics of capital, rather than the personal merit of whoever's name happens to be on the masthead. He's not saying Gates didn't do anything remarkable in the 1980s. He's saying that the story of self-made genius, used to explain a fortune's existence 40 years ago, gets quietly and lazily extended to explain that same fortune's continued growth today, when the actual explanation has shifted to something much more structural and much less personal. To make this less abstract, Piketty introduces a concept that's become genuinely influential in its own right: the supermanager. This is his term for a relatively new social category, not the landed aristocrat, not quite the classic capitalist owner either, but the celebrity-tier executive. The CEO, the top hedge fund manager, the elite corporate lawyer whose labor income alone, salary plus bonus plus stock options, has exploded to levels that, historically, only inherited capital could produce. The numbers here are genuinely wild. Piketty's data on the United States shows that the share of total national income captured by just the top 0.1% of earners, not capital owners, earners, people technically drawing a salary, roughly tripled between 1980 and the 2010s, and that a huge share of that group is concentrated in finance and top corporate management. A modern Fortune 500 CEO's total compensation can run into the tens of millions of dollars a year, a figure that would have made even Vautrin blink, because Vautrin never imagined that labor income could behave like an inherited fortune. Piketty's explanation for why this happened in America and Britain particularly, but much less in continental Europe or Japan, is one of the more genuinely contested parts of the book. Economists still argue fiercely about it. His preferred explanation leans heavily on corporate governance and norms. Executive pay committees, often staffed by other executives, operating with weakly constrained, somewhat self-referential ideas about what competitive pay should look like in a low-tax environment that did nothing to discourage the spiral. Other economists push back hard, arguing instead for skill-based stories, that globalization and technology genuinely did make top managerial and financial talent far more valuable, and that pay simply followed value created. Piketty doesn't fully dismiss that account, but he's skeptical it can explain the sheer scale of the gap on its own, and points out that the explosion is heavily concentrated in finance and management specifically, rather than spread evenly across all genuinely globalized, skill-intensive professions. Here's why this matters for the inheritance story we've been building all episode. A supermanager's giant pay package, sustained over 20 or 30 years and invested even moderately well, becomes exactly the kind of large, compounding fortune that gets passed on to children, who, crucially, did not do the work themselves. In other words, today's self-made supermanager income is tomorrow's old-fashioned Vautrin-style inheritance, one generation later. Merit, in effect, manufactures the next generation's inherited privilege, which means a society can have plenty of impressive, talented, hard-working self-made people at the very top right now, and still be sliding, generation by generation, back toward the patrimonial pattern Balzac described in 1835. So now we have all the pieces on the table. Wars that destroyed capital, decades that rebuilt it, houses that quietly transformed ordinary families into asset-rich dynasties, and supermanagers whose extraordinary salaries are busy becoming the next century's inherited fortunes. In our final part, we're going to take this entire argument and drop it directly onto 2026, Gabriel Zucman's wealth tax fight in France, Bernard Arnault calling him a far-left activist, and Piketty himself jumping into that exact fight on social media just last year. Part 5, Vautrin in 2026, the Zucman tax, Arnault, and what Piketty would say now. Let's finish where every good economics chapter should end, with billionaires yelling at each other on the internet. In September 2025, Bernard Arnault, at the time the head of LVMH and depending on the week, either the richest or second richest man on earth, gave an interview to the Sunday Times. The subject was a tax proposal that had been quietly building momentum in France for over a year. A minimum 2% annual levy on individual net worth above 100 million euros. It had already been nicknamed, inevitably, the Zucman tax, after the economist who designed it, Gabriel Zucman, who happens to be one of Piketty's own most prominent intellectual successors, and his actual co-author on several major studies of global wealth. Arnault did not hold back. He called the proposed levy an offensive that is deadly for the French economy. He went further, branding Zucman a far-left activist whose entire academic career, in Arnault's framing, was really just ideology wearing the costume of economics. Piketty, Zucman's old mentor, remember, responded directly on social media and did the one thing economists are supposedly never allowed to do. He made it personal with numbers. He pointed out that France's 500 or so richest people had seen their collective wealth increase by roughly 500% between 2010 and 2025, and then ran the arithmetic that a 2% annual tax, applied to that kind of fortune, would take roughly a century to merely return their wealth to where it had stood back in 2010, assuming, generously, that they received no further income in the meantime. His dry, pointed question to Arnault, is that really what's bringing the French economy to its knees? Notice what's actually happening in that exchange, because it's the entire chapter, replayed live, in real time on social media, by the people whose academic careers built the underlying argument. Arnault is making a version of the productive capital defense. Large fortunes fund real investment, real jobs, real enterprise, tax them aggressively, and you damage the whole economy, not just the wealthy individual. It's a serious argument, and a group of prominent economists made a more measured version of it in the French press, projecting the tax would raise far less revenue than supporters claimed and could push wealthy households to relocate abroad, exactly the kind of capital flight France has worried about since at least the 1980s, when a similar wealth tax experiment under President Mitterrand produced real, documented departures of wealthy households to Belgium and Switzerland. Piketty and Zucman's counterargument is the data we've been building all episode. that the very largest fortunes have, for decades now, compounded at rates dramatically exceeding overall economic growth. Zuckman's own research found that the wealthiest American households pay a meaningfully lower effective tax rate, once every tax is counted, than middle-class households do, and that a fortune compounding at 6 or 7% annually can comfortably absorb a 2% levy and still keep growing faster than the rest of the economy around it. This isn't redistribution in the old, dramatic sense of confiscating wealth. It's closer to a speed limit on an engine that, left alone, simply outpaces everything else in the room, year after year, by mathematical default. The political result, for now, is genuinely instructive. In late 2025, France's National Assembly debated several versions of the tax: Zuckman's original 2% proposal, alternative proposals with different thresholds from other parties, and a narrower government counterproposal targeting holding companies specifically. Polling found overwhelming public support for some version of the tax, including strong support even among voters of President Macron's own political camp, about as close to political unanimity as French public opinion ever gets on anything. And yet, when the votes were actually counted, the Assembly rejected the core proposal. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's maybe the most Piketty-coded fact in this entire script. Overwhelming public support, and the policy still failed in Parliament. That gap between what the broad population wants and what concentrated wealth and political influence can successfully block is, in miniature, the entire second half of Piketty's book, the part about how, once capital becomes concentrated enough, it doesn't just generate income, it generates political weight capable of defending its own continued growth. By 2026, the idea hadn't died, it had gone global. Zuckman pitched a similar minimum tax on billionaires internationally, picking up explicit backing from several heads of state and finance ministers across multiple continents. The pitch is structurally identical to the domestic French version: a floor, not a ceiling. If you're already paying the equivalent of 2% of your wealth through ordinary taxes, you owe nothing extra. It's a remarkably modest, almost timid proposal by historical standards, nowhere near the 90+% wartime tax rates we talked about in Part 2, and it has still triggered some of the angriest billionaire commentary in years. Which brings us at last back to Vautrin, sitting in that grim Parisian boarding house in 1835, doing arithmetic for a horrified young law student. Vautrin's argument was never really about morality. It was about a simple structural fact. When capital compounds faster than labor can possibly earn, rational behavior tilts toward capital, toward inheriting, toward marrying well, toward owning rather than working, regardless of what any individual person deserves or has earned through effort. Piketty's entire 11th chapter, and frankly his entire book, is an extended argument that this structural fact comes and goes across history, not because human nature changes, but because policy, war, taxation, and demographics periodically reshuffle the relative speeds of capital and labor. For about 30 years after 1945, labor temporarily won that race, almost by historical accident. Since the 1980s, capital has been steadily closing the gap again, through housing markets, through supermanager pay packages that mature into inherited fortunes, through a billionaire class compounding wealth at rates the broader economy simply cannot match. And the fights happening in Paris and London, and at international summits right now this year, are not really new fights at all. They are the same argument Balzac dramatized in a smoky Parisian dining room nearly 2 centuries ago, now conducted through finance bills, parliamentary votes, and bitterly worded posts on social media, instead of a convict's whispered advice to a desperate law student. Rastignac, in the end, refuses Vautrin's offer. He chooses the long, uncertain, merit-based path instead, and Balzac lets him survive it, bruised, disillusioned, but intact. Piketty's quiet, 200-year-later question for all of us is simply this. Is the society you're actually living in still one where that choice, Rastignac's choice, genuinely makes structural, mathematical sense? Or has the math, once again, started quietly favoring Vautrin? That's Chapter 11. Thanks for sticking with the whole arc, from a boarding house that smelled of boiled mutton, all the way to a billionaire's villa and an international tax summit, exactly 200 years apart, arguing about exactly the same thing.